Hello and welcome to Quiz Class. I'm your host, Ellen, and today we have 100 questions on general knowledge. Let's take a look at our Quiz Class awards. And here they are. Let us know how you rank in the comments at the end, along with the answer to the bonus question. Which 1950s TV show pioneered the use of sweetening, adding artificial laughter to create what we know as laugh tracks? I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, or Leave It to Beaver? The Honeymooners. What unusual material did designer Elsa Schiaparelli use to create buttons for her 1930s circus collection that shocked the fashion world? Beetles' wings, candy, or miniature thermometers? Candy. Which psychological principle observed in 1960s consumer research describes how people value things more highly once they own them? Scarcity heuristic, endowment effect, or commitment bias? Endowment effect. What was the Green Book, published between 1936 and 1966? A government manual for sustainable agriculture, a field guide to medicinal plants, or a travel guide for African Americans during segregation? A travel guide for African Americans during segregation. Which home construction technique, popularized in the 1970s, involved stacking earth-filled bags to create structures? Earthship architecture, superadobe, or cob building? Superadobe. What 1980s television broadcasting innovation was marketed as Captain Midnight's secret decoder device? Early satellite TV descrambler, VCR recording timer, or the closed captioning device? Early satellite TV descrambler. Which psychological phenomenon, identified in the 1970s, describes how jurors often construct narratives to make sense of evidence? Narrative fallacy, sequential reasoning bias, or story model of juror decision-making? Story model of juror decision-making. What unique feature characterized Slow Glass, a fictional material in Bob Shaw's 1966 science fiction story, Light of Other Days? It changed color, it could bend light around corners, or light took years to pass through it? Light took years to pass through it. Which 1940s innovation in retail was first called the Phantom Doorman? Automatic sliding door, anti-theft security gate, or motion-activated greeter? Automatic sliding door. What was kinograms, a popular entertainment medium of the 1920s? Early animated greeting cards, home movie projector slides, or phonograph record labels? Early animated greeting cards. Which 1960s architectural movement coined the term Adoism to describe improvised purpose-specific design solutions? Brutalism, radical architecture, or international style? Radical architecture. What was the mother of all demos? A landmark 1968 technology presentation. First demonstration of hypertext and video conferencing, initial public unveiling of color television, or the introduction of household robots. First demonstration of hypertext and video conferencing. Which literary technique, popularized in 1970s speculative fiction, involves creating detailed, invented languages? Xenolinguistics, metafiction, or cognitive estrangement? Xenolinguistics. What culinary innovation was known as chicken a la king when introduced in the 1890s? The first canned meat product, creamed chicken and pastry shells, or frozen pre-cooked poultry? Creamed chicken in pastry shells. Which home entertainment technology of the 1980s was nicknamed DiscoVision during development? Laserdisc, Beta Hi-Fi, or quadraphonic sound? Laserdisc. What was the Yale program? An influential approach from the 1950s, an architectural education model, a child development theory, or a persuasion research methodology? A persuasion research methodology. Which 1970s broadcasting practice was known as bicycling in the television industry? Rapid switching between shows during ratings periods, alternating between two camera angles, or physically shipping program tapes between stations? Physically shipping program tapes between stations. What innovative material developed in the 1930s was originally called polywog? Silly putty, neoprene, or Scotchgard? Silly putty. Which architectural element revived in the 1980s postmodern design was described as a broken pediment with nothing to pediment? Flying buttress, split pediment, or mansard roof? Split pediment. What was the kitchen debate of 1959? A TV cooking competition, labor dispute among appliance manufacturers, or political discussion between Nixon and Khrushchev in a model kitchen? A political discussion between Nixon and Khrushchev. Which cognitive bias describes how we tend to see ourselves as less susceptible to biases than others? Blind spot bias, fundamental attribution error, or self-serving bias? Blind spot bias. What was the billion-dollar barrage, a term coined in the 1940s? Allied bombing campaign in World War II, post-war advertising blitz, or economic stimulus program? Post-war advertising blitz. Which fashion trend of the 1920s was known as the masculine silhouette for women? The garçon look, flapper style, or Art Deco design? Garçon look. What early computer interface innovation was nicknamed the bug by its inventors at Xerox PARC in 1972? Trackball, computer mouse, or light pen? Computer mouse. Which 1950s musical technique pioneered by Les Paul involved recording multiple versions of a performance and combining them? Vocoder processing, reverb chamber, or sound-on-sound recording? Sound-on-sound recording. What was decision fatigue, a concept first articulated in 1990s? Executive burnout syndrome, computer programming error cascade, or deteriorating decision quality after making many choices? Deteriorating decision quality. Which 1960s educational innovation was first called talking typewriter? Language lab audio system, dictation training machine, or early computer-assisted instruction? Early computer-assisted instruction. What culinary presentation style popular in 80s fine dining was characterized by tall, architectural food arrangements? Deconstructed plating, vertical food, or molecular gastronomy? Vertical food. Which early electronic musical instrument developed in the 20s used radio frequency oscillators controlled by hand movements? Tertonium, ondas martenot, or theremin? Theremin. What was the memory palace? A mnemonic technique rediscovered and popularized in the 1970s. Spaced repetition system, method of Loki, or chunking strategy? Method of Loki. Which home appliance innovation of the 50s was marketed as the cold pantry? Frost-free refrigerator, chest freezer, or ice maker? Frost-free refrigerator. What was architectural brutalism, which emerged in the 1950s? A style using raw concrete and bold geometric forms, a movement rejecting decorative elements, or a construction technique using prefabricated modules? A style using raw concrete and bold geometric forms. Which psychological phenomenon identified in 1990s research describes how group pressure can lead to extreme decisions? Group polarization, Abilene paradox, or bystander effect? Group polarization. What was the Fosbury flop introduced in the 1968 Olympics? A swimming dive variation, a gymnastics dismount, or a high jump technique going over the bar backward? A high jump technique going over the bar backwards. Which textile innovation of the 30s was initially called artificial silk? Nylon, rayon, or polyester? Rayon. What was MEMIX? A device conceptualized in 1945 but never built. An early fax machine prototype, a hypothetical hypertext information system, or a mechanical memory enhancement device. A hypothetical hypertext information system. Which literary movement of the 1970s involved authors using mathematical constraints to generate texts? Oulipo, New Journalism, or Magical Realism? Oulipo. What decorative technique, revived in the 1980s, involves applying metallic foil to furniture using adhesive? Decoupage, gilding, or trompe l'oeil? Gilding. Which psychological principle observed in marketing research during the 50s describes how consumers prefer a middle option? Anchoring bias, decoy effect, or compromise effect? Compromise effect. What was the Skinner box, developed in the 1930s? An early air conditioning unit, an apparatus for studying operant conditioning, or a prototype isolation chamber? An apparatus for studying operant conditioning. Which 1990s design movement embraced digital aesthetics with pixelated graphics and glitch art? Lo-fi design, Memphis revival, or deconstructivism? Lo-fi design. What was the Great Stink that led to major infrastructure changes in 1858 London? Severe sewage pollution in the Thames, industrial chemical spill, or contaminated water supply? Severe sewage pollution in the Thames. Which cognitive bias, identified in 1960s decision research, causes people to search for information confirming existing beliefs? Availability heuristic, confirmation bias, or recency effect? Confirmation bias. What was the Burning Man when it first began in 1986? A political protest using effigy burning, a firefighter training program, or a small beach gathering with an 8-foot wooden figure? A small beach gathering with an 8-foot wooden figure. Which fashion innovation of the 1970s was originally designed for medical support? Velcro closures, platform shoes, or controlled top pantyhose? Controlled top pantyhose. What archaeological technique, developed in the 1940s, uses electrical resistivity to detect buried structures? Resistivity survey, magnetometry, or ground penetrating radar? Resistivity survey. Which 1930s anthropological concept describes how cultural elements spread from one society to another? Cultural diffusion, structural functionalism, or ethnomethodology? Cultural diffusion. What was the spiral of science, a theory proposed in 1974? How public opinion forms when people fear isolation, the increasing volume of political discourse, or the pattern of decreasing voter participation? How public opinion forms when people fear isolation. Which 1980s medical imaging technology was initially called nuclear magnetic resonance imaging before being renamed? MRI, the PET scan, or the CT scan? The MRI. What culinary technique, popular in molecular gastronomy of the 1990s, involves rapidly freezing ingredients with liquid nitrogen? Flash freezing, cryogenic preparation, or jellification? Cryogenic preparation. Which architectural feature common in 1970s commercial buildings was described as bringing the outdoors indoors? Atrium, curtain wall, or skylight? Atrium. What was the permanent breakfast, an urban intervention started in 1996? A food preservation technique, a 24-hour diner concept, or a performance art event where people eat breakfast in public spaces? A performance art event. Which philosophical concept developed in the 1970s describes how power creates rather than merely discovers knowledge? Power knowledge, linguistic turn, or structural Marxism? Power knowledge. What was the Mechanical Turk, an 18th century hoax that inspired a modern crowdsourcing service? A perpetual motion machine fraud, an early assembly line system, or a chess-playing automaton secretly operated by a person? A chess-playing automaton secretly operated by a person. Which 1940s innovation in automobile design was marketed as the step-down design? Hydraulic brake system, retractable running board, or integrated chassis and body with lowered floor? Integrated chassis and body with lowered floor. What was the Truman Show delusion identified by psychiatrists in 2003? Fear of surveillance in public spaces, belief that one's life is a reality TV show, or inability to distinguish fiction from reality? Belief that one's life is a reality TV show. Which 1920s journalistic practice was called jazz journalism? Sensationalist reporting with large photos and bold headlines, musical criticism in mainstream newspapers, or undercover reporting in nightclubs? Sensationalist reporting with large photos and bold headlines. What was the transparent factory opened by Volkswagen in 2002? Car factory with glass walls allowing for public viewing, a manufacturing facility with full financial disclosure, or plant producing clear acrylic automobile components? A car factory with glass walls. Which educational philosophy developed in the 1970s emphasized problem posing rather than banking knowledge? Critical pedagogy, constructivism, or multiple intelligences? Critical pedagogy. What was the mechanical bride analyzed by Marshall McLuhan in 1951? Early household appliance marketing, advertising's effect on modern consciousness, or robotic manufacturing techniques? Advertising's effect on modern consciousness. Which architectural technique involves trompe-l'oeil painting to create the illusion of elaborate architectural elements? Quadratura, perspective projection, or anamorphosis? Quadratura. What was the quantified self movement that emerged in the 2000s? Statistical approach to personality assessment, self-tracking with technology to improve health and performance, or data-driven career development strategy? Self-tracking with technology. Which literary technique, pioneered in James Joyce's Ulysses, presents characters' thoughts as direct interior monologue? Stream of consciousness, free indirect discourse, or epistolary narration? Stream of consciousness. What was the Pepsi Challenge, a marketing campaign from the 1970s? Extreme sports competition sponsored by Pepsi, contest to design a new Pepsi logo, or a blind taste test comparing Pepsi to Coca-Cola? A blind taste test. Which psychological effect observed in 1990s research describes how people prefer information presented in story form? Narrative bias, framing effect, or mere exposure effect? Narrative bias. What was the Wunderkammer, revived as a curatorial approach in contemporary art? Experimental sound installation, multisensory exhibition space, or cabinet of curiosities displaying diverse objects? Cabinet of Curiosities. Which 1950s educational approach emphasized discovery learning, where students explore concepts independently? Montessori method, the Waldorf method, or Brunner's discovery learning theory? Brunner's discovery learning theory. What was the Diderot effect, a consumer behavior pattern identified in the 18th century? Collecting encyclopedic knowledge of products, purchasing additional items to match an initial acquisition, or tendency to reject new technology? Purchasing additional items to match an initial acquisition. Which textile printing technique developed in the 1960s allowed mass production of photographic images on fabric? Heat transfer printing, discharge printing, or Devore process? Heat transfer printing. What was the uncanny valley, a theory proposed in 1970? Discomfort caused by almost human robots or animations, geographic region with unexplained phenomena, or a marketing term for products that defy categorization? Discomfort caused by almost human robots or animations. Which ethnographic approach developed in the 1980s focuses on studying science laboratories as cultural spaces? Laboratory studies, science and technology studies, or actor network theory? Laboratory studies. What was the Oulipo Group, founded in 1960? Experimental musicians exploring synthetic sounds, political cartoonists using visual puzzles, or writers using mathematical constraints to generate literature? Writers using mathematical constraints. Which architectural feature popular in 1990s corporate buildings was designed to encourage spontaneous employee interaction? Green roof, collision wall, or light well? Collision space, that is. Collision space. What was the long tail, a concept introduced in 2004? Financial planning approach for extended retirement, design philosophy emphasizing elongated structures, or business strategy focusing on selling small quantities of many unique items? A business strategy. Which psychological phenomenon identified in 1990s, 1970s research describes how we attribute others' actions to their personality, but our own to circumstances? Fundamental attribution error, self-serving bias, or actor-observer bias? Fundamental attribution error. What was the Lindy effect, a concept popularized in the 2000s? The influence of dance halls on popular music, the cyclical nature of fashion trends, or the idea that non-perishable things age in reverse? The idea that non-perishable things age in reverse. Which literary device common in 1960s experimental fiction involves a story within a story? Mise en abîme, metonymy, or intertextuality? Mise en abîme. What was the digital divide, a term coined in the 1990s? A gap between those with and without access to computers and internet, conflict between analog and digital music enthusiasts, or technical barrier between computer programming languages? A gap between those with and without access to computers. Which culinary technique developed in the 1960s involves vacuum sealing food in plastic and cooking at precise low temperatures? Molecular gastronomy, sous vide, or flash freezing? Sous vide. What was the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment proposed in 1971? A philosophical device for determining principles of justice, an educational approach to eliminate preconceptions, or a psychological test for implicit bias? A philosophical device for determining principles of justice. Which art movement of the 1980s combined graffiti and fine art techniques? Neo-expressionism, trans avant-garde, or superflat? Neo-expressionism. What was the Moog when first introduced in the 1960s? An electronic music sequencer, a modular analog synthesizer, or a portable recording studio? A modular analog synthesizer. Which cognitive bias identified in 1960s research causes people to overestimate their abilities relative to others? The overconfidence effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect, or optimism bias? Dunning-Kruger effect. What was the Whole Earth Catalog, published between 1968 and 1972? A comprehensive map of ecological zones, a counterculture magazine featuring tools for sustainable living, or an early environmental impact assessment? A counterculture magazine featuring tools for sustainable living. Which architectural movement of the 1990s incorporated digital design processes and non-Euclidean geometry? Parametricism, deconstructivism, or critical regionalism? Parametricism. What was the Hawthorne effect, observed in industrial psychology studies of the 1920s? Decreased efficiency under artificial lighting, productivity improvements due to being observed, or enhanced creativity in natural environments? Productivity improvements due to being observed. Which musical technique popularized the 1950s recording involves artificially adding reverberation to vocals? Chamber echo, double tracking, or flanging? Chamber echo. What was the Overton window, a concept developed in the 1990s? A range of politically acceptable policies at a given time, architectural feature maximizing natural light, or a marketing technique for limited time offers? Range of politically acceptable policies at a given time. Which philosophical approach developed in the 1970s analyzes the social construction of scientific knowledge? Logical positivism, critical realism, or social constructionism? Social constructionism. What was the Saturnian system, a design principle used in 1960s city planning? Multi-level underground transportation, separating pedestrians from vehicle traffic, or concentric circular neighborhood layouts? Separating pedestrians from vehicle traffic. Which 1970s audio technology was marketed as the sound of the future? Quadraphonic sound, Dolby noise reduction, or digital audio? Quadraphonic sound. What was the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis debated throughout the 20th century? A theory of cultural determinism, a linguistic model of universal grammar, or the idea that language shapes thought and perception? The idea that language shapes thought and perception. Which psychological phenomenon observed in the 1950s describes the formation of positive feelings toward a familiar stimulus? Cognitive dissonance, classical conditioning, or mere exposure effect? Mere exposure effect. What was the Venus Project, initiated in the 1970s? An early virtual reality simulation, a proposal for a resource-based economy and redesigned cities, or a women's health research initiative? A proposal for a resource-based economy and redesigned cities. Which literary movement of the 1980s combined magical elements with realistic narratives in Latin American fiction? Dirty realism, magical realism, or cyberpunk? Magical realism. What was the Keeling curve, first established in the 1950s? A mathematical model of population growth, a graph showing diminishing natural resources, or a measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels? A measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Which textile innovation developed in the 1940s for military use later revolutionized outdoor clothing? Lycra, Gore-Tex, or Kevlar? Gore-Tex. What was the Garden City movement, which influenced 20th century urban planning? An approach combining urban and rural features in planned communities, a campaign to increase public parks in cities, or an architectural style? An approach combining urban and rural features in planned communities. Which sociological concept developed in the 1950s describes how people navigate between conflicting social roles? Symbolic interactionism, dramaturgical analysis, or role strain? Role strain. What was the Turk, an 18th century invention that influenced modern technology? An early mechanical calculator, a wind-up humanoid figure, or a chess-playing automaton that concealed a human operator? A chess-playing automaton that concealed a human operator. Which 1956 legislation created the interstate highway system in the United States? That is our bonus question. Please let us know the answer in the comments and how you did with our quiz class Einstein rewards. Thanks for playing and see you next time. Bye-bye.